Elara existed in the quiet spaces of the large house, a gentle ghost who tended to the living. For 40 years she had been the silent pulse of the home, the steady hand that smoothed sheets, stirred soup, and polished the silver until it reflected a world that never seemed to fully include her. She was Arthur's second wife, a quiet woman he had married a year after his first wife's passing, and she had inherited not just a husband, but a role. She became the caretaker of his home, of his memories, and of his two children, Richard and Cynthia, who were already teenagers when she arrived, their grief a fortress she was never invited to enter. They had tolerated her presence with the cool, polite indifference one reserves for household staff. Elara had accepted this. She had loved Arthur with a deep, unassuming devotion, and her service to his family was an extension of that love. She asked for nothing, and in return she received a life of comfortable invisibility. She moved through the grand rooms, her footsteps muted by thick Persian rugs, her presence as subtle as the scent of lemon oil on the mahogany furniture. She learned the language of the house, the groan of the third stair, the way the morning lights slanted through the dining room window, the particular chill of the north-facing guest room. It was her world, a kingdom she managed but did not rule. Richard and Cynthia grew up and moved out, but their presence lingered, sharp and critical. They returned for holidays, their visits brief and transactional, their eyes sweeping over the home as if taking inventory of their future possessions. They spoke to their father, and through their father, but rarely directly to Elara. When they did, it was with a tone of thinly veiled condescension, questions about the household budget, or a passive-aggressive comment about a piece of furniture she had rearranged. Elara never challenged them. She would simply nod, her smile placid, and retreat into the quiet efficiency of her duties. She knew her place. She was the keeper of the flame, not the inheritor of the hearth. Then Arthur's health began to fail. It was a slow, creeping decline that stole his strength piece by piece. Elara's role shifted from caretaker of the house to caretaker of the man. The final years were a blur of doctor's appointments, medication schedules, and long, sleepless nights spent listening to the rhythm of his labored breathing. Richard and Cynthia's visits became even more perfunctory. They would stand at the foot of their father's bed, their discomfort palpable, their conversations stilted and brief. They saw the illness as an inconvenience, a tedious delay in the inevitable transfer of wealth. They never once offered to help. They never asked Elara if she was tired, if she needed a break, if her own heart was breaking as she watched the love of her life fade away. She was simply part of the scenery of their father's decline, the dutiful nurse whose presence was expected and therefore unremarkable. When Arthur finally passed, the silence he left behind was immense, a hollow echo in the vast house. For 2 days, Elara was utterly alone with her grief. She wandered the empty rooms, her hand trailing over the armchair where he used to read the paper, her gaze lingering on the indentation his head had left on his pillow. The quiet was a physical weight, pressing down on her. Then the phone rang. It was Richard, his voice brisk and devoid of emotion. "The reading of the will is tomorrow at 10, he had said, not a question but a command. Be at the lawyer's office. The day of the will reading was gray and damp, the sky weeping a fine mist that clung to Elara's coat. She sat in a plush leather chair in the lawyer's opulent office, feeling small and out of place. Richard and Cynthia were already there, dressed in sharp, expensive black, their faces composed in masks of solemnity that did not quite reach their eyes. They nodded at her, a curt, dismissive gesture, and then turned their attention to Mr. Sterling, the family lawyer, a man whose loyalty, Elara knew, had always been to Arthur's business and, by extension, to his children. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat and began to read from the thick document in a dry, monotonous voice. The words flowed over Elara, a river of legal jargon and financial terms she did not fully understand. She heard mentions of stock portfolios, investment properties, and company shares. All of it, The entirety of Arthur's considerable fortune was to be divided equally between his beloved children, Richard and Cynthia. Elara waited, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She expected little, perhaps a small pension, a fund to ensure she could live out her remaining years in modest comfort. It was all she had ever wanted. Finally, Mr. Sterling reached the last page. He paused, looking over his spectacles at her for the first time. "And to my wife, Elara," he read, his voice flat, "for her years of service, I leave the property I purchased some 30 years ago in the town of Seabrook." He paused again. "And with it, the contents of the lockbox kept in my personal safe, to which she holds the only other key." A flicker of a smile crossed Cynthia's lips. Richard shifted in his chair, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. The Seabrook property. Elara's mind struggled to place it. Then the memory surfaced, faint and dusty. It was her grandmother's old house, a place she hadn't seen since she was a girl. Arthur had bought it on a whim decades ago, a sentimental gesture after she had told him stories of her childhood summers spent by the sea. He had intended to fix it up, but life had gotten in the way. It had been abandoned for half a century, a forgotten relic on a forgotten stretch of coastline. It was worthless. The lawyer slid a large manila envelope across the polished desk toward her. Inside was the deed, a brittle, yellow document, and a small, heavy object wrapped in velvet. "That is everything," Mr. Sterling said, closing the folder. Richard stood up, all business. "Well, that concludes that," he announced. He looked at Elara, his gaze cold and appraising. "We will be taking possession of the house at the end of the week. I trust you can have your personal effects gathered by then." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her home, the only home she had known for 40 years, she was being evicted. "Of course," she heard herself whisper, the sound swallowed by the thick carpet and heavy drapes. Cynthia let out a small, cruel laugh. "Don't look so glum, Elara," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "At least Father left you a house. You always did love a fixer-upper." The humiliation was a hot, searing wave that washed over her. She was being discarded, thrown out like a worn piece of furniture, her 4 decades of devotion reduced to a punchline. She was erased. She was eliminated. She managed to stand, her legs trembling. She took the envelope from the desk, her fingers closing around the hard object within it. She did not look at them. She could not bear to see the triumph in their eyes. She walked out of the office, out of the building, and into the cold, indifferent mist. A 72-year-old widow with a deed to a ruin, and a future that had just been declared null and void. The drive back to the house was a blur. Elara sat in the back of the taxi, the manila envelope a lead weight in her lap. The house, her house, loomed into view, its familiar lines suddenly alien and menacing. It was no longer her sanctuary. It was their property. She spent the next few days in a daze, moving through the rooms like a sleepwalker. Every object was a memory, every corner a ghost of a life that was no longer hers. The worn velvet of Arthur's favorite chair, the chipped teacup she had used every morning for 30 years, the faint pencil marks on the doorframe in the hallway, measuring the heights of children who had never considered her a mother. She packed her belongings into 2 worn suitcases, her clothes, a few books, a small collection of photographs. It was shocking how little of her was actually in the house. Her life had been woven into the fabric of the home itself, and she could not pack the scent of baking bread, the warmth of the fireplace, or the feeling of safety she had once found within its walls. On the 3rd day, Richard and Cynthia arrived with a moving crew. They did not come to help her. They came to watch. They stood in the foyer, arms crossed, directing the movers with impatient gestures. Cynthia walked into the living room, where Elara was carefully wrapping a small porcelain bird Arthur had given her. "Do you mind?" Cynthia said, gesturing to the box. "We're having the appraisers come through this afternoon. We don't want your clutter in the way." The word clutter hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Elara looked down at the few boxes that contained the sum of her life. She felt a cold, hard knot form in her stomach. It was anger, an emotion so foreign she barely recognized it. She said nothing. She simply finished packing her bird, taped the box shut, and carried it out to the taxi she had waiting at the curb. She did not look back. She could not. If she had, the dam of her composure would have broken, and she would not grant them the satisfaction of her tears. She checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, a place that smelled of stale smoke and disinfectant. The room was small and grim, with a lumpy bed and a window that overlooked a parking lot. This was her new reality. The despair she had held at bay finally crashed over her. She sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the room a roaring in her ears. She was homeless. She was penniless, save for a few $1,000s in a personal savings account she had painstakingly built from the household allowance Arthur had given her. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her life of service, of quiet devotion, had been a fool's errand. She had poured herself into a family that was not hers, into a home that was never hers, and now, in the winter of her life, she had been swept out with the dust. She thought of her own family, all long gone. Her parents, her sister. There was no one to call, no one to turn to. She was an island, and the tide was rising. For 2 days, she barely moved from the room. She lay in the dark, the curtains drawn, the television flickering with images of a world that felt 1,000,000 miles away. She contemplated her future, a bleak landscape of poverty and insignificance. She saw herself in a state-run home, a nameless old woman in a paper gown, waiting for an end that could not come soon enough. The fear was a physical thing, a cold hand gripping her heart. On the third morning, as the weak sunlight filtered through the gap in the curtains, a different feeling began to stir within her. It was the anger again, but this time it was not a fleeting spark. It was a slow, burning ember. She had been a victim. She had been wronged. But she was not dead yet. She sat up, her back stiff. Her gaze fell on the manila envelope lying on the rickety nightstand. The inheritance. The cruel joke. She picked it up and for the first time emptied its contents onto the bedspread. The deed to the ruined house, and the object wrapped in velvet. Her fingers, trembling slightly, unwrapped the cloth. It was a key. It was old and heavy, made of brass now tarnished with a greenish patina. The head of the key was ornate, fashioned in the shape of a seahorse. It felt strangely significant in her hand. There was also a small, folded note tucked into the velvet. It was Arthur's handwriting, the familiar, elegant script now slightly shaky. She unfolded it. The note was short, cryptic. "For the home only you remember," it read. "The sea holds the key to the lock." The words made no sense, and yet they were a flicker of light in the suffocating darkness. A clue, a puzzle left for her by the man she had loved. It was not a solution. It was not a promise, but it was something. It was a glimmer. Elara looked at the deed, then at the key. The town of Seabrook, a place she had not thought of in 60 years. She had no other options. Her past had been taken from her, and her future was a terrifying blank. All she had was this one ridiculous, insulting thread. She decided to pull on it. The next day, Elara withdrew most of her savings, leaving just enough to cover any unforeseen emergencies. She bought a one-way bus ticket to Seabrook. The journey was a slow crawl across the state, a passage through landscapes that were as unfamiliar as her own future. She sat by the window, watching the cities and suburbs give way to rolling farmland, then to dense, forgotten forests. The bus was filled with a transient collection of souls, each lost in their own world. Elara felt a strange kinship with them. They were all in transit, suspended between a place they had left and a destination that might not welcome them. As the hours passed, the air began to change. She could smell it before she could see it, a faint, briny tang on the wind. The sea. The bus finally pulled into Seabrook late in the afternoon. The station was just a weathered bench in front of a boarded-up general store. The town was smaller than she remembered and far more dilapidated. It seemed to be clinging to the edge of the continent by a thread, a collection of salt-bleached houses huddled together against the relentless wind. She asked the bus driver for directions to her grandmother's old address. He pointed down a narrow, cracked road that led toward the cliffs. "Not much out that way anymore, ma'am," he said, his expression a mixture of pity and curiosity. "The old Henderson place hasn't been anyone living there since before my time." Elara thanked him and began to walk, her two suitcases bumping along behind her. The road was steep, and the wind whipped at her coat, carrying the cry of gulls. With every step, a strange sense of homecoming mingled with her trepidation. Faint, ghostly memories began to surface. The taste of wild blackberries from the bushes that had once lined this road. The feel of her grandmother's hand in hers. The sound of the foghorn from the distant lighthouse. Finally, she saw it. Perched on the edge of the cliff, silhouetted against the gray sky, was the house. It was worse than she could have imagined. And yet somehow, it was still beautiful. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood a silvery, weathered gray, like driftwood. The porch sagged, and several windows were boarded up, but the structure itself was defiant, its sharp gables and sturdy stone chimney standing firm against the elements. It was not a ruin, it was a survivor. A tangle of overgrown roses and ivy clung to the walls, nature's stubborn attempt to reclaim it. Elara felt a strange resonance with the place. She too was weathered, abandoned, but still standing. She walked up the creaking steps and tried the front door. It was locked fast, the wood swollen with decades of damp sea air. She found a broken window at the side of the house, carefully cleared the remaining shards of glass, and hoisted herself through, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She was breaking into her own house. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust, salt, and time. Sunlight, heavy with dancing dust motes, streamed through the grimy windows, illuminating a scene frozen in time. Furniture stood draped in white cloths, ghostly shapes in the dim light. A layer of dust covered every surface, a soft gray blanket over the past. Elara walked through the rooms, her footsteps echoing in the profound silence. This was the living room, where her grandmother had taught her to knit. This was the kitchen, with its massive, rust-covered wood stove. And this was her grandmother's study. It was a small room at the back of the house, with a large window that looked directly out at the churning sea. A heavy desk stood in the center of the room, and the walls were lined with empty bookshelves. On one wall hung a massive, faded tapestry depicting a fleet of old sailing ships. Elara ran her hand over its rough, woven surface. She remembered being fascinated by it as a child, tracing the paths of the ships with her finger. She sank into the dusty armchair by the window, suddenly exhausted. The scale of her task seemed impossible. The house needed a new roof, new windows, plumbing, electricity. It would take a fortune she did not have. The despair she had felt in the motel room began to creep back in. This was not a new beginning. It was a tomb. Then her eyes fell upon the hearth. A massive stone fireplace dominated the room, and as she looked at it, Arthur's cryptic note echoed in her mind. "The sea holds the key to the lock." Her gaze scanned the intricate stonework of the mantelpiece. It was carved with maritime motifs, waves, shells, and in the very center, a beautifully detailed carving of a seahorse. It was a perfect match for the key in her pocket. Her heart began to beat faster. She knelt before the fireplace, her fingers tracing the stone seahorse. She felt a small, almost imperceptible seam. She pressed it. With a soft, grinding sound, a section of the stone shifted, revealing a small, dark cavity. Inside was a metal box, rusted and salt-stained. It was a lockbox, and on its front was a keyhole, shaped not like a normal keyhole, but like the twisting body of a seahorse. "The sea holds the key to the lock," she whispered. She took the heavy brass key from her pocket. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely guide it. She slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. With a deep, satisfying click, the lock turned. This was it, the glimmer of hope. She lifted the heavy lid of the box. Inside there was no treasure, no gold, no jewels. There was only another key, smaller and more modern, and a thick, sealed envelope with her name on it, written in Arthur's hand. The disappointment was a brief, sharp pang, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of adrenaline. This was not the end of the puzzle. It was the next step. She tore open the envelope. It was a letter many pages long. "My dearest Elara," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and my greatest fears have come to pass. I know my children. I know their greed. I know they will have left you with nothing but this old house, believing it to be a final insult. But this house, my love, is not an insult. It is your fortress." Tears welled in Elara's eyes as she read on. Arthur's letter was a confession, a love story, and a battle plan. He wrote of his weakness, his inability to confront his own children, his desperate desire to keep the peace in his final years. He had known about their cruelty, their dismissiveness of her, and it had broken his heart. "I could not fight them in life," he wrote, "but I can protect you in death. For decades I have lived a secret life. My passion was not for the stock market, but for the sea. I have spent a fortune, not the one they know about, but a second, hidden one, amassing one of the world's finest private collections of maritime artifacts." He explained that he had used this house, his sentimental gift to her, as his secret gallery. He had spent years and a vast sum of money retrofitting it, creating a hidden, climate-controlled sanctuary for his treasures. "The second key in the box opens the door," the letter continued. "Look behind the fleet of ships that you so loved as a child. It is time for you to see what I have built for you." Elara's gaze flew to the large tapestry on the wall. She stood up, her body buzzing with a nervous energy she had not felt in years. She walked to the tapestry and pulled at its edge. It was heavy, but it swung away from the wall on hidden hinges, like a door. Behind it was not wallpapered plaster, but a solid steel door, the kind one might see on a bank vault. In its center was a small, modern keyhole. The revelation. It was real. All of it. With a trembling hand, she inserted the second key and turned it. There was a series of soft clicks as internal bolts retracted. She pulled the handle, and the heavy door swung open with a whisper of compressed air. Elara stepped across the threshold and gasped. She was standing in a long, brightly lit gallery. The air was cool and dry. Glass cases lined the walls, each one professionally lit and containing artifacts of breathtaking beauty. There were gleaming brass sextants and chronometers, intricate ship models in massive glass bottles, and ancient, hand-drawn maps of worlds long gone. Sections. On one wall hung a collection of 18th century naval swords, their hilts gleaming. Sections. In the center of the room, on a velvet pedestal, was a ship's figurehead, a magnificent carving of a mermaid with eyes of inlaid mother-of-pearl. It was a museum, a secret private museum filled with priceless treasures. This was her inheritance, not a ruin, but a kingdom. She walked slowly through the gallery, her fingers brushing against the cool glass of the display cases. It was overwhelming. The scale of Arthur's deception, of his love, was staggering. He had built this for her, a secret world hidden in plain sight, waiting for her. At the far end of the gallery was a small, built-in desk. On it sat a single, thick, leather ledger. Elara returned to Arthur's letter. There was more. "The collection is your security, my love," he wrote. "There is a name and number in this envelope for a trusted appraiser who will understand its true value. It is more than enough to ensure you live the rest of your days in comfort and dignity. But there is one more thing. a weapon should you need it. He directed her to the ledger. For years, he wrote, his handwriting becoming tighter, angrier. I suspected Richard was mismanaging the company. I hired a private forensic accountant. The ledger on the desk contains the proof. He and Cynthia have been embezzling from the family business for over a decade, siphoning funds into offshore accounts. The inheritance they so greedily snatched is already a hollow shell of what it should have been. They are criminals, Elara, and that ledger is the proof. Elara's hand rested on the leather cover of the ledger. The hidden leverage. It was not just wealth that Arthur had left her. It was power. The power to defend herself. The power to exact justice. She sank into the chair behind the desk, the letter in her lap, the silent, priceless treasures of the gallery surrounding her. The tears that came now were not tears of despair, but of a profound, shattering release. She wept for the man who had loved her so fiercely, so secretly. She wept for the years of her own blindness, her own quiet acceptance of a role that was so far beneath what he had seen in her. And as the tears subsided, something new took their place. A quiet, unyielding strength. The transformation had begun. The next morning, Elara woke on a makeshift bed of dusty linen in her grandmother's house. For the first time in a long time, she did not feel fear. She felt purpose. She made a list. First, survival. Then, restoration. She walked back into the main part of town, her posture straighter, her stride more confident. She found a small grocery store that was actually open, its bell jingling merrily as she entered. An old man with a kind, weathered face looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked. "I hope so," Elara said, her voice clear and steady. "My name is Elara. I'm staying at the old Henderson place." The man's eyes widened in surprise. "Henderson? Well, I'm Samuel. My father ran this store when your grandmother was still alive. Haven't seen anyone go up that road in 30 years. He was the kind stranger, a link to a past she was reclaiming. They talked for an hour. Elara bought groceries, and Samuel gave her the name of a local contractor, a man named Ben who was honest and reliable. That afternoon, Elara made her first phone call. She dialed the number for the appraiser from Arthur's letter. A crisp, professional voice answered. "Mr. Dubois' office?" "My name is Elara Vance," she said, amazed at the authority in her own voice. "I was referred by Arthur Vance. I have a collection I need appraised." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a sudden warmth in the voice. "Mr. Vance, of course, we have been waiting for your call. Mr. Dubois will be on the next flight." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Mr. Dubois, a distinguished man with an encyclopedic knowledge of maritime history, arrived. When Elara showed him the vault, his professional composure dissolved into pure, unadulterated awe. He spent a week cataloging the collection, his excitement growing with each piece he examined. The final valuation was a number so large it seemed fictional. Elara was not just wealthy, she was one of the wealthiest women in the country. With a line of credit secured against a small portion of the collection, the restoration of the house began. Ben the contractor and his crew descended on the property. They were a team of local craftsmen who took pride in their work, treating the old house with a reverence that touched Elara deeply. They replaced the roof, installed new windows, and brought the plumbing and electricity into the 21st century. Elara was there every day, not as a passive observer, but as the director of the project. She made decisions about colors, materials, and design, her own long-dormant aesthetic sense blossoming. She was not just restoring a house, she was building her home. As the house came back to life, so did she. The quiet, invisible woman disappeared, replaced by a confident, elegant matriarch. She bought new clothes, simple but well-made, and found that her years of quiet observation had given her an innate sense of style. The town of Seabrook, initially wary of the newcomer, slowly began to embrace her. They saw the lights on in the old Henderson place. They saw the care with which it was being restored, and they saw the quiet dignity of the woman who was bringing it back from the dead. Samuel, the store owner, became a fast friend, stopping by with fresh bread and local gossip. Elara found herself, for the first time in her life, part of a community that saw her and valued her for who she was. Months passed. Autumn gave way to a wild, blustery winter, and then to a hopeful spring. The house was finished. It was magnificent. The silvery wood had been cleaned and sealed, preserving its weathered beauty. The interior was a blend of rustic charm and modern comfort, a testament to its history and its new purpose. Elara spent her days in the study, her grandmother's study, looking out at the sea. She had the ledger from the vault locked in a safe, a silent, waiting weapon. She had not needed to use it. She had not heard a word from Richard or Cynthia since the day she had left her old life behind. She hoped she never would, but she knew them. Their greed was a compass that would, eventually, point them in her direction. The call came on a bright Tuesday morning in May. It was an unknown number. She answered. "Elara?" The voice was strained, barely recognizable. It was Richard. "We need to talk." Elara felt a calm, cold certainty settle over her. The confrontation was at hand. "There's nothing to talk about, Richard," she said, her voice even. "We've heard things," he pressed, a note of desperation in his voice. "That you're living in that old shack, that you're fixing it up. There are rumors. People are saying you found something." "I found a home," Elara said simply. "We're coming down," he said, his voice turning hard. "Whatever you found on that property belongs to the estate. It belongs to us." "The property is mine, Richard," Elara replied, her voice like ice. "But by all means, come. I'll be waiting." She hung up the phone. She was not afraid. She walked to the safe, took out the heavy leather ledger, and placed it in the center of the polished mahogany desk in her study. Then she went to her closet and chose a simple, elegant cream-colored dress. She was ready. 2 days later, a sleek, black luxury car, now several years out of date and streaked with road dust, pulled up in front of the house. Richard and Cynthia stepped out. They looked diminished. Their expensive clothes were slightly rumpled, and there were lines of stress and anger etched around their eyes and mouths. The easy arrogance they had worn like a second skin was gone, replaced by a grasping, desperate avarice. They stopped dead, staring at the house. This was not the dilapidated shack they had imagined. This was a magnificent coastal estate, restored to a glory it had probably never known. The gardens were manicured, the windows gleamed in the sun, and a gentle plume of smoke rose from the stone chimney. Their faces, a mixture of shock and fury, were a study in thwarted greed. The front door opened. Elara stood on the porch, a picture of calm, regal elegance. She was not the timid gray woman they had expelled from their lives. Her hair was styled, her posture was perfect, and her eyes, once downcast and evasive, now met theirs with a direct, unwavering gaze. The power shift was immediate and absolute. They were the intruders here. She was the mistress of the manor. "Richard," "Cynthia," she said, her voice cool and polite. "You made good time." Cynthia found her voice first, a shrill, accusatory squeak. "What is this? Where did you get the money for all this?" "I managed," Elara said, a faint, enigmatic smile on her lips. "Please come in. We have things to discuss." She led them not into a comfortable living room, but into the study. The room was immaculate, the afternoon light glinting off the polished wood and the brass fittings of a telescope by the window. The large, ancient tapestry of the fleet of ships was back in its place, a silent guardian of the secret it concealed. Richard's eyes darted around the room, calculating, assessing. "You found money," he stated, his voice thick with resentment. "Father must have hidden cash here. It's part of the estate. It's ours." Elara did not answer. She simply gestured to the 2 chairs in front of the desk. They sat, their movements stiff and awkward. She remained standing, a position of authority. Her gaze fell upon the leather ledger on the desk. "I did find something," she said softly. "Something your father left for me." She pushed the ledger across the desk toward them. Richard opened it, his expression one of confused impatience. Cynthia leaned over his shoulder. Elara watched as their eyes scanned the first page. She saw the flicker of recognition, then the dawning of pure, abject horror. The color drained from Richard's face. Cynthia let out a small, strangled gasp and stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. The ledger was meticulous. Dates, account numbers, transaction records, copies of incriminating emails, a decade of their secret crimes laid bare in Arthur's precise, damning detail. Richard slammed the book shut, his face a mask of pale fury. "This is a lie, a forgery," he snarled, but his voice trembled. There was no conviction in his denial. "Is it, Richard?" Elara asked, her voice quiet, yet carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Your father was many things. Conflict avoidant, yes. Weak, at times. But he was not a fool. And he loved me. He knew what you were. He knew what you would do. And he prepared for it." She let the silence stretch, a heavy, suffocating blanket. She watched them squirm, their arrogance collapsing into panic. They were no longer the powerful heirs. They were common thieves, caught red-handed. "What do you want?" Cynthia whispered, her voice hoarse with fear. "Money? Is that it? You want money? Money? Is that it? You want money?" Elara almost laughed. The irony was exquisite. They could not conceive of a world that did not revolve around money. "I have more money than you could possibly imagine," Elara said, the statement a simple fact, not a boast. "What I want is peace." She walked to the window and looked out at the sea, her back to them. "Here is my offer," she said, her voice resonating with finality. "It is non-negotiable. You will sign a legal document, which my lawyer has already prepared, relinquishing any and all current or future claims on me, my property, or any assets I may possess. You will walk out of this house, and you will disappear from my life forever. You will never contact me again. You will never speak my name again." She turned to face them, her eyes like chips of flint. "And in return," she concluded, "this ledger and the original documentation your father collected will not be turned over to the federal authorities." The final checkmate. It was not just their fortune on the line. It was their freedom. Richard stared at her, his mind racing, searching for an angle, a loophole, a way out. He found none. He was trapped, utterly and completely outmaneuvered by the quiet, invisible woman they had so casually discarded. His face crumpled, the fury and greed replaced by the pathetic, ugly face of defeat. Cynthia was openly weeping now, silent, desperate tears of self-pity. "We'll sign," Richard croaked, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Elara nodded, her expression unreadable. She picked up the phone and made a call. An hour later, her lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman from the city, arrived with the documents. Richard and Cynthia signed them without a word, their hands shaking. When it was done, Elara walked them to the door. She did not say goodbye. She simply watched as they got back into their dusty car and drove away, their shoulders slumped in defeat, their ill-gotten empire already crumbling around them. She watched until the car was just a black speck on the horizon, and then she closed the door on her past forever. The aftermath was quiet. Elara never heard from Richard or Cynthia again. Through her lawyer, she learned that the company, already hollowed out by their embezzlement and now suffering from their incompetent management, had collapsed into bankruptcy within a year. The grand house she had once tended was sold to pay off a fraction of their debts. Their downfall was not loud or dramatic. It was a slow, quiet slide into the obscurity they so richly deserved. Elara, meanwhile, began her new life. She had the wealth, the security, the peace she had been promised. But she found that it was not enough. She looked at the magnificent secret collection Arthur had built, and she knew it was not meant to be hidden forever. It was a legacy, and a legacy was meant to be shared. She began a new project, one born not of necessity, but of passion. She worked with architects and historians to transform the house and the hidden vault into a public institution. Sections. She added a new wing to the house, carefully designed to complement the original structure, creating space for exhibits and a small research library. Sections. The town of Seabrook watched, first with curiosity and then with a growing sense of pride and excitement. Sections. This forgotten town was about to be put on the map. A year after the confrontation, the Seabrook Maritime Museum and Archive had its grand opening. It was a gift to the town, a tribute to her grandmother's memory, and a testament to Arthur's secret, enduring love. But Elara's new purpose did not end there. The memory of her own despair, of her own brush with homelessness and insignificance, had left an indelible mark on her. She established the Vance Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing legal and financial assistance to elderly people who were victims of family-related financial abuse and fraud. Her own story, kept anonymous, became the foundation's guiding principle. She had found her voice, and now she would use it to speak for those who could not. Years passed. Elara, now in her late 70s, was no longer the ghost in the house. She was the heart of the community. Her days were full. She would spend her mornings overseeing the museum, often personally guiding tours for visiting school children, her eyes sparkling as she told them stories of the sea. Her afternoons were dedicated to the work of the foundation, reviewing cases and offering quiet words of encouragement to people whose situations so closely mirrored her own. Her evenings were spent in quiet contentment, sometimes sharing a simple dinner with her friend Samuel, other times sitting in her study, reading by the fire. One cool autumn evening, she stood on her porch, a warm shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The sea was calm, its surface a shimmering sheet of liquid gold. She looked at the lights of Seabrook twinkling in the twilight, at the sturdy, beautiful house that was her home, her fortress, her legacy. She had lost everything, and in doing so she had gained the world. She had been underestimated, discarded, and left for ruin. But in the wreckage of her old life, she had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. She had found not just security, but purpose, not just vindication, but peace. True worth, she now knew, was not found in the inheritance one received, but in the life one built. It was found in resilience, in dignity, and in the quiet, unyielding power of a woman who had finally, in the winter of her life, come home to herself. The sea breeze was cool on her face, and it carried not the scent of loss, but the promise of tomorrow. And Elara smiled. She was at peace.